Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this discussion. We are at the very busy SiGMA 2023 in Malta, and I'm joined today by some very experienced people from the payments and banking industry. I think there's many years of experience between all of us, and today we're having a discussion on information security and compliance. It should be quite an interesting conversation, especially since we're doing it over a beer. So I'll go ahead and introduce my guests for today, and this is the first of these discussions we're having at this 3-day event at SiGMA. So I'll go ahead and introduce my guests. So we have Daniel Buttigieg, who is the Chief Commercial Officer at APCOPay. We have Keith Kauki, who is the Information Security Officer at MeDirect Bank, and we have Stephen Buchner, who is the CEO of Taris. First of all, thank you, all of you, for joining us today for this discussion. I'll start with you, Daniel. So, in terms of payments, the payment industry has experienced transformation, right? So ever since COVID, obviously COVID has left its mark as well. So how has the risk within the payment industry, let's say, changed? What are the risks that we're currently facing, or emerging threats as far as the industry?
Thanks. Very pertinent question, Trevor. You're completely right. Basically, due to the advent in COVID, we see fraud picking up at not only the trajectory of speed, but even the complexity or the subliminalness of how people today are constructing, I would say, scams on target people, not only obviously merchants but also banks. It's become sometimes really creative. We obviously as a company help the merchant get connected to the bank, so we can kind of see both sides to the coin. So on the one hand, you see a lot of, for example, additional increased ransomware. You see phishing attacks that are really architected in a really complex manner. I mean, just taking, for example, phishing attacks. Phishing attacks would constitute about a good 95%, are caused by human error when it comes to phishing attacks. You would have a lot of fraud that then obviously opens up and cascades into multiple facets when obviously the victim is targeted. And sometimes the victim doesn't even know they're targeted at the get-go, You then obviously have ransomware, you have malicious attacks, you have banking apps getting targeted, and so many other different forms, which up to a few years back were already there. COVID just obviously allowed for more people spending more time getting even more creative. And long gone are the days when people walk into a bank and do a heist, and have a hold-up. Today it's the same thing over just a global landscape, where today you have an additional level of industries and verticals for people to play with and get creative. For example, we see account takeovers, credit card fraud. We see people, for example, doing things like cryptojacking, for example, where machines are being used as mules just to basically use up resources, and all these different forms and sorts of fraud that were there. It's just now becoming more prevalent, basically.
Absolutely. In fact, you mentioned some of the risks and threats which continue to emerge even from the most recent breach reports from last year.
Yeah.
Some of the phishing, ransomware, and malware type of attacks continue to be popular. I'll ask the same questions to you, Steve. So you have experience, 30 plus experience in taking up positions with a number of institutions. What changes are you seeing in terms of risks?
Thanks, Trevor. The biggest changes that I really see are, and unfortunately, they're the types of changes that we in the industry, as a payment service provider, or offering multiple channels to trusted merchants, it gives us a sense of comfort. We're just adding solutions to them. But consider things like what's gone on in the Ukraine, and of course, more recently what's happened in the Middle East. What's changing in the control environment, the regulatory environment. Concepts of the OFACs and sanctions has changed significantly. And it's not just a change of having put new names and new countries on there, but we have learned, and we're in the public domain, we know what Europol is up to and Interpol is up to. The ability to protect yourself from accidentally violating things that OFAC have put in place because of external crisis. We have very seasoned compliance people and lawyers that work for us, but how much experience do we actually have in dealing when the regulatory environment reacts to what's happening in the press? I think other changes are, we all remember GDPR when it was first issued. We were shocked, and they talked about the significant fines that would be issued. Have we seen any of the fines? Have we become a little bit more comfortable with the concept of data privacy? I believe we have. And if I was a very scary, conservative risk person, I would say it's only a matter of time until the first fine is issued, as long as it's someone else and not us. My suggestion would be have a discussion in-house. Look at the policies and procedures that safeguard information, not just information that goes out, but keeping information that needs to stay in-house, stay only in-house. It isn't accidentally shared, or in a worst case, taken over with aggression.
Absolutely. Keith, I'll turn to you. In terms of information security, cyber security, what are companies, where is the investment being made? What are companies spending the money on?
So when it comes to investments in cyber security, I think what we are seeing is traditionally we were focusing on a layered controlled approach. So organizations investing, looking at what the new technologies are, what's out there, how can I protect my infrastructure, starting from the endpoint up to the perimeter, and also cloud security. So that's just just from a technology point of view. On the other hand, we're also seeing an investment in consultancy. So especially when it comes to security testing, so penetration testing services, that's on the increase, even due to DORA requirements, which we think that DORA will introduce a mandatory red team testing every 3 years. So I mean, it's a mixture of services and technology. Again, once you buy the technology, then you need people to manage it. So it's not just a matter of buying the technology. There is no silver bullet, but you need people to manage and monitor and respond to, and also fine tune the technologies that you invest in.
Well, and I suppose the last thing you mentioned, the people is a huge factor right now, right? Because there is a big shortage of people in certain areas with the right skills, and that is a risk in itself at the moment. Daniel, so in terms, you have experience dealing with merchants. So in terms of cybersecurity, would you think merchants are mature enough and are committed enough towards cybersecurity, or is it thanks to service providers like yourselves acquirers and other entities or regulators that impose and enforce certain controls that they are taking it seriously. So do you think the merchants at the merchant level there is enough cybersecurity and awareness?
I mean, we deal with merchants from all walks of life. Trevor, we deal with startup merchants, who aspire to become the big behemoths. We deal with also the very mature merchants who have been in the market for a long time as well, and anything in between kind of thing. And also we spread around different verticals as well. We touch merchants from the gaming industry, from the airline industry, from the public sector, so on and so forth. I would say that in general, there's a twofold. One is the maturity. Yes, I would say is there, or at least there is a lot of knowledge around what should be done. But sometimes, unfortunately, in practice, it's a balancing act at putting enough resources and not putting enough resources at the same time. What I mean to say is, people are sensitive to obviously the pitfalls of getting in a breach. People obviously know what damage can be caused by suffering a DDoS attack. Anybody who gets warned or threatened against a DDoS attack obviously is not going to take it lightly. And it's when it happens that you see the maturity and controls in place of how a merchant would react to that. So in general, I would say most of the merchants would be at par at what needs to be done, and they would have a good scrutiny. I mean, we have also merchants, for example, who we deal with, even at the get-go, would be very sensitive to, for example, what the PCI DSS regulation and framework constitutes, not because initially they want to be PCI themselves, but because out of good practice at wanting to protect their business and their business's longevity, they say, listen, let's get external pen tests done once every 6 months or so, every year or so. Not because they need it, but because it's a good practice to have to do so. On the education part of it, perhaps a lot of merchants rely on the resources they take in that typically come from other companies, where they say, listen, we're getting a seasoned IT security officer who would have previously worked with big brands, typically going into startup companies, in order for them to say, listen.
Obviously, we're talking about cybersecurity, but we cannot not mention compliance. So, Kate, in terms of compliance, are entities managing to meet all their compliance obligations in-house, or do they have to rely on external resources to be able to comply? Because obviously compliance requirements are getting more and more complex. What do you think?
I think this question is very subjective, so it depends on the size, the entity and the size of the team that's handling the adherence to the compliance. So again, it depends. So what we've seen, for example, from through GDPR, the example you mentioned earlier, is that at the time we weren't aware on how much GDPR would actually be enforced. So the regulator, in Malta we have the Information Data Protection Commissioner's office. I think it's an element of the element of how much they are equipped, how many resources they have to actually assess adherence to the regulation, adherence by different organizations to the regulation. If it is a small organization, then yes, external consultancy, external third parties will be are typically hired to provide assurance. If it is a medium to large organization, I think the first stance would be, let's try to assess what the requirements are, do a gap assessment, see how much effort is is required to comply with the new regulation. Coming up, we have DORA in the financial industry. We also have NIS2 for entities that are considered as part of the critical infrastructure. So at this stage, I'm sure that many entities, many organizations are evaluating where they stand, what's required to comply with, and if there needs to be any areas which are maybe gray areas or they are not unclear, then yes, third-party assistance is desired, would help.
Steve, so we're talking about cybersecurity, but of course, or I should say, we're talking about compliance. And one of the things that comes up in every compliance set of requirements is incident response, or the need for an incident response plan. Now, obviously, there's a big difference between having an incident response plan for the sake of just meeting compliance and having a proper incident response function. Do you think that entities are really prepared when it comes to responding to incidents, or is it just are we more focused on ticking the box rather than having a proper function?
Thanks, Trevor. Incident management is, of course, critically important. Why? Because we're obliged to have it. When you get audited, you need to show that you've updated it in accordance with your disclosure obligations. One of the things that I've done that has been appreciated is helping companies assess their readiness for incident management. One of the easiest ways of doing that is find out what how a competitor has been struck with something that is classified as an incident, and pull your team together that would be involved. You can have members of your information security team. You're probably going to have a compliance folks in there, maybe somebody even from the risk department, and close the door and tell them that it's happened in-house and see how they react. And ask them to basically stand up on one of those dry walls and start writing down what they would do. And if taking a look at what happened with a competitor isn't a good fit, especially for larger companies that say have annual or semi-annual audits, pull out, and doing this in anticipation of an audit, it also makes sense, is find out where a significant audit failure could raise the eyebrows of, say, the board of directors, or worse, it would have to be disclosed to potential regulators. Have the team, again, go through the scenario that this has happened without us knowing so. Were we prepared? And let's base it on what we said we were going to do. It's basically teaching. I've got a 13-year-old son. I taught him how to bicycle first on 4 wheels, then 3 wheels. Now he's on 2, and he's going to try on 1. Started off where people feel comfortable, so if it does happen, they've sat with the right people, faced similar challenges, and came up with what at the time was considered a good solution.
Yeah, and of course, as I asked Kate before, if you obviously can't have the necessary skills and resources and expertise in-house, then of course seek the right people. Kate, a difficult question. You're coming from the banking industry. You probably in a constant state of audit, right? You're constantly being subjected to an audit. Is there over-regulation? Is it too much? I start with you actually, Daniel, and then move to Keith. Is there too much regulation?
I don't think over-regulation is. The term over-regulation, regulation is there to control, to preserve, to mitigate before things happen, and to have a plan. Right? I mean, if there's no regulation, then probably most people would fail to even come up with a plan, and then all hell breaks loose once people run into problems and trouble. So over-regulation can never be an unwelcomed thing. However, it becomes, I think, an over-regulation once it starts stifling the business part. And that's where I think most people then start being tempted with turning it around or transforming it around into, as you mentioned earlier, a checkbox exercise. So if people believe that what they are doing and the resources they are investing into having a remediation plan before they actually need to execute the plan in action, they truly believe that that is plausible and is something that the business needs just in case stuff happens, then people will be fully on board. And no matter the size of the entity. The size of the entity, sometimes the bigger the entity, obviously the more controls and bureaucracy and hierarchies and whatnot, and we're all used to the massive structures. Sometimes a small company is more nimble to basically navigate and prepare for contingencies. So I think at this current state that the whole ecosystem is in, we can tend to allow regulation to become over-regulation unless we properly assess the critical things and the things we can afford to, I won't say put to aside, but the things that would become overarching compared to the things that we really need to do. Education is key, I think, and a lot of education. I think you can never have a situation where you are over-educating, for example. For if you invest in proper education, training courses, ongoing training courses, not, yes, my people are, my staff are educated, so I'm fine. It has to be a continuous journey to innovative training and keep people on board. Then it will not become over-regulation.
I can see you agreeing. So
yes, I definitely agree with what Daniel said. But I mean, taking an example with DORA, recently I was asked a question by the regulators on how much do you think you are prepared when it comes to DORA, how much your program is aligned to DORA. I mean, again, this depends on the organization. But coming from a bank and a systemic bank, yes, so we already practice and have a number of controls that are aligned to DORA, so it's not a big surprise to us. For example, mentioning the ABA guidelines on ICT and security risk management, so that's something which we have been expected to adhere to, and we a few years ago. So DORA isn't a big surprise to us.
My last question for you again, Kate. A question which I mean, it might be different and one which I think is important. So ever since COVID, we said there's been a lot of changes, but one thing that has changed as well is the concept of remote working, right? The concept of working from home. Which has become almost, even after COVID, now it's become a business as usual. How has working from home affected the risks and the threats that a company would face as a result of information security for yourselves as a bank, but also to other entities that now have to contend with not just protecting their corporate environment, but also remote users?
Yes, that's a very good question. I think the majority of organizations are either fully remote or have introduced a hybrid, a hybrid option for employees to work from. When it comes to cyber risks, it's protecting your data. So there are obviously you don't have any control on what employees are doing at home, but you try to implement as many technical controls as possible to protect your environment. For example, when it comes to restricting USB ports, restricting printing. Again, enforcing the use of corporate devices rather than personal devices for employees to to work from home. Obviously, the risks have increased. So when you have organizations that use that have BYOD policy in place, that means that they can access their organizations that work remotely, and they have, let's say, limited or not as much as supervision by the entity. There are different controls that have been that can be put into place, such as, for example, one using BYOD. There's certain vendors have implemented the use of sandboxing technologies, where one would a device would be sandboxed so that any work-related data would live in a separate environment. So there's a segregation of environment when compared to non-work-related data. And there's a big element, as well as Daniel pointed out at the start of this discussion, of security awareness. So that's key. So users have to understand what are the risks, why I need to do that, why I need to lock my computer when I'm at home, and if I have any family members around, why do I have to put highly confidential documents away when I'm not working. I mean, so there's this awareness, and continuous awareness is fundamental.
Absolutely, thank you very much, guys. Thank you very much. This was a very interesting discussion. I wish we had more time to go into more depth on some subjects. We have incidentally we have another discussion tomorrow with 3 other guests that we'll have. But thank you very much for your input. Like I said, this was very interesting, and I suppose until the next conversation we can do a cheers. Thank you, guys.